One of the questions we often get asked about is website rendering and page rendering and how all of that works. So in this video, Matthew and I are going to talk about what page rendering is and how it works for search engines and users in a browser. So with that, Matthew, do you want to kick us off and just explain what page rendering is and what the rendering process is?
Yeah, so rendering is where the browser gets code from the server, and then the browser has to go through and process all that code and turn it into a page that people can actually see and begin to interact with. So that whole process of transforming from what the server sends back to what people actually see in the browser is the rendering process in simple terms. There's a lot of complexity that goes in with that. As we talk about rendering, there's two big terms to keep in mind here. One big term is server side rendering, the other one is client side rendering. So when people talk about server side rendering, what they're referring to is the code that comes back directly from the server. So that's the stuff that the server sends back to the browser, kind of the raw code is the other term you might hear referred to as. And then the other code is client side code. So this is the code that's been rendered. So the browser's gone through and it's processed things. And in particular, with client side code, they've executed JavaScript. And so as they've executed JavaScript, JavaScript can change the HTML structure, change content on the page. So you end up with a different kind of outcome, different code on here. And that's referred to as client side rendered code. Sometimes people just refer to that as rendered code. So you've got that whole process of actually building out the page. And depending on what code is coming in, you have kind of different types of code that are behind the page. So we've got server side or client side as the two biggest things we end up talking about and looking at a lot.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and thanks for defining that because those two areas are maybe not always talked about in separate ways of really understanding what's happening from the server side and what's happening from the client side. Things can go wrong with rendering in both areas, but more typically we tend to see it in the client side rendering where things maybe fail or don't render correctly for search engine robots and thereby really impacting a site's performance. Um, Often that comes in the form of some of the most important content on the page maybe not being rendered correctly.
Yeah. And when you think about what loads with and without JavaScript, one of the simplest things that we help clients out with is just getting a sense of, okay, what does come in via JavaScript? What elements on the page? What pages have the most? And any content that's really important, you want to be able to make sure that that is going to be in server side code where it's more reliable, more likely to be seen versus client side code. So I was just bringing up, we have just a demo page that we've worked with just to show it. Um, so this is just a demo page we've constructed, right? You can see there's some images and stuff on here. So just one of the simple tests that we've done is this toggle.js browser extension, turn that off, and you can just see, okay, what content goes away on here. And
Yeah.
even with that, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, and yeah, with that, you can see that like right out of the gate, the header image is gone. And if that
Mhm.
header image is an important element of the page for helping users or search engines get rooted in the context of the page, that could really impact the evaluation of the site.
Absolutely can. And we have a whole separate video that dives into more about Toggle.js and other extensions and tools you can use to dig into that more deeply. And you absolutely can dig into this more deeply. But yeah, just that simple one, like that header image, if that's gone or text is gone, what does that change about the page? Maybe it doesn't change anything, and I think that's one thing that we've talked about before is that just because things are different isn't actually bad. Google isn't going to punish you if your, client side code is different than your server side code.
Right.
Yeah, it's more understanding kind of that equivalency between the two.
Yeah, absolutely. And making sure that that equivalency is very clear. I think one thing that we've run into before is that buttons, whether it's a call to action button to a lead generation form or an add to cart button or things like that, that are rendered client side instead of server side, that could really influence the interpretation of the page's intent. Where is it? What type of page is it? And are those important calls to action visible in the initial load of the page? If not, there could be a chance that it just gets missed and then gets kind of misevaluated in that
Mhm.
rendering process, which can be a challenge. I think then that gets to, we've run into some other issues with kind of the page rendering, whether it's code that's blocked or things like that, that also influence Google's kind of interpretation of the page, with things like maybe CSS being blocked or JavaScript being blocked at the robot.txt file, as an example, and then what that does to the evaluation of the page in the rendering process.
Mhm. And I mean, Google has long said that you don't want to block CSS or JavaScript because they need to be able to see the entirety of that page to understand it. If you block something, they're not going to be able to render that page properly. And so you want to avoid, having robots.txt blocks. Um, One tool that we have used to kind of look at that is just robots.txt validators. So, like taking a JavaScript file from that test page you just had up and throwing it in here, you can pick your user agent and then you can test and you can see whether or not it's allowed. Um, and I guess when we've done this for clients, we have seen people who are blocking CSS or JavaScript, and there is, um, yeah, a lot of times just conversations around it. I guess one question that we kind of sometimes grapple with is, are there JavaScript files that maybe you want to block? Are there CSS files you want to block? How do you make that determination? Why would you want to block a JavaScript file? Why would you want to block a CSS file? Is there ever a time when you should? Gone round and round with those questions before.
Yeah, and those are really hard to address. And so, what you really need to do to be able to address that is understand what each JavaScript file does or what each CSS file influences in terms of layout and performance, and then element by element, page by page, um, be able to see, does this matter? Does it impact the rendering process? If it's blocked, would it break an experience? If it does, then yeah, you probably don't want to block those. But maybe
Right.
there are times and places where you can block them because they are just adding to the load.
Right. Like it slows down the crawl too much or
Yeah.
something. One that comes to mind that we have seen is if it is JavaScript that truly is only for users like a account or personalization scripts or something. If those are really heavy JavaScript files, maybe those, but you want to be careful with it. And I guess that kind of gets to, the question is, well, why? And if you think about how Google works, when they're evaluating the page, right, they start by crawling the page, they fetch the HTML code, but then they have to process this. They have to understand this page. And so pages get moved into the rendering process here by Google. And so if you block a CSS file, or a JavaScript file, what you're basically doing is you're cutting off this whole process. So that way, this whole stuff, down here, this just goes away and Google's not able to do anything with that because you're blocking that file. So you want to be, very careful, with doing this. You don't want to block this part of the process, um, without a really good reason for doing that, because then you're kind of preventing Google from doing everything they need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes, unfortunately, we see that it does get accidentally blocked. It update rolled out and something got blocked for one reason or another. And then all of a sudden, that page rendering process really does get influenced. I think the other thing that that brings up is sometimes there are those third party scripts or third party tools that you're using to maybe bring in content. to your web page. And those third parties can make some decisions about what JS or CSS files are available and whether they're blocked or not. And so not only is it important to understand what's happening with the JS and CSS files on your site, but also from any third party tools that you might be using and what are they doing to maybe block those. Using that same tool that you just showed with the robot.txt block, you can also test some of those to, again, just get an understanding of what might be influencing page rendering and that particular phase of crawling and indexing by
Yeah,
Google.
because if it's a third party script, I mean, if it's an analytics tool or something, okay, fine, that gets blocked. But bots don't need to crawl that. And in case of analytics, maybe you don't want bots crawling that because that's going to influence things in a bad way in your analytics, reports. But if that third party script is bringing in product content or reviews content or images, that stuff you don't want to have blocked, um, at all. So that becomes, kind of a big hit to your website. If that stuff is getting blocked, Google's not going to get a complete understanding of what you have to offer. It could also start to look manipulative, like you're trying to hide something from a bot. That's not good. That's going to get you into trouble as well. I guess too, as we're talking about this, we've been very Google centric. Um, but there are other search engines, there are other bots, there are AI tools now that we need to think about with this, and they render things in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of the kind of evidence and conversation happening in the SEO space, especially as it relates to AI and how that is influencing things, it does seem that AI tools probably aren't executing JavaScript at this point. And so, therefore, then any content or features that are rendered via JavaScript aren't going to be seen and evaluated in those AI engine evaluations and crawls. And so that also is really shifting how maybe websites are going to be built and how pages need to be rendered if AI is part of your ongoing strategy.
Right. I'm going to guess that OpenAI is probably at some point going to be able to render JavaScript and execute that and be able to look at a page more fully. There's reasons to think that they would want to do that, especially if they're serious about going after becoming a search engine. But they're not there yet. I mean, it's taken Google, over a decade to, really perfect things and get things, and even they're not 100% reliable. Even just in the last few weeks, we've done some work for clients where they were doing fade in effects or they had infinite scroll or load more, and that all depends on JavaScript. Google's not able to necessarily work with all those things. Load more and infinite scroll is one of the big ones that we see tons of problems with, where just Google can't crawl that. AI bots can't crawl that. No bots are able to crawl through that.
Yeah,
Um, yeah.
absolutely. And all of that becomes just such an important part of your site's evaluation, your web page's evaluation, and how and where you're going to be able to show up in search engines today and whatever that looks like in the future. And so,
Yeah. Well, and the other part to this too to think about, and the other thing that this starts getting into, especially as you think about kind of future proofing and building everything forward, it's not only thinking about where you're going to use JavaScript or not, but it's also thinking about the speed implications, and that probably becomes a whole separate conversation that we could dive into about speed. But if things are slower, if your website doesn't load correctly, that effectively means that JavaScript may not load or CSS files may not load, and that's going to distort things. So as you do think about future proofing your site, it's thinking about, okay, how do we, build things in a way that work for, all bots who are coming to the site, but also think about how do I build the site in a way where it works for people who might be on slower connection speeds or bots that might be on slower connection speeds, because it is really important to make sure that things get rendered for everybody.
yeah, you're absolutely right. So, with that in mind, if you have any questions about how your website is loading and rendering for all the various bots that may be crawling your site in order to understand who you are, what you do, and really help you show up in search engine results, we're here to help. So you can always reach out to us. You can email me at Andrea@elementive.com, or you can always email Matthew@Elementive.com. We really appreciate you joining us and watching this video. If you like this video or would like to see more like it, please subscribe to our channel. Thank you so much for watching.